You know, there are some things that have us scratching our head in befuddlement, where we wonder, why is that? Like, why do people constantly return to the refrigerator with hopes that something new would have materialized? You do that too? You go there, you look inside, you don't find anything you want. You come back 15 minutes later and you look again. What do you think happened in the last 15 minutes? You ever wonder why you never see a headline, "Psychic wins lottery"? If people evolved from apes, then why are there still apes? And then I always had this question, why is the word abbreviated such a long word? Who tastes the dog food when it says new and improved flavor? Why is lemon juice made with artificial flavor and dishwashing liquid is made with real lemons? And finally, but perhaps the most ponderable of all, statistics say about sanity that 1 out of every 4 persons is suffering from some sort of mental illness. So I want you to think of your 3 best friends. And if they're all okay, on to the subject of the day. Back in the 1700s, the days of the saintly Baal Shem Tov, there was someone in the community who was deathly ill. The family came running to the Baal Shem Tov and said, "Rebbe, please do something. Say a prayer, we need a miracle." The Baal Shem Tov asked that a special wax candle be made. He took the candle with him to the forest, and he went to a particular tree. He lit the candle next to this tree, and then he invoked some special prayers, some mystical meditations, some phrases. And sure enough, the blessings came, and the person had a miraculous recovery. Years later, a similar incident took place with the Baal Shem Tov's successor, the Maggid of Mizrich. Again, a life was hanging in the balance. The family came to the Maggid and asked for a Baal Shem Tov-style miracle. Like his predecessor, the Maggid asked that a wax candle be prepared. He went to the same forest. He went to the same tree that the Baal Shem Tov went to before, and he said the following: "The prayers that the Baal Shem Tov said when he did this miracle, I do not know. But here is the forest, here is the tree, and here is the candle. In the merit of my master, may he help bring a blessing." And the miracle came. A generation later, a similar crisis, a matter of life and death, a miracle was needed, and this time it went to Rabbi Moshe D of Sasov. Rabbi Moshe D said, "The prayers of the Baal Shem Tov, I do not know. Where that tree is, I do not know. Which forest they went to, I do not know. So what I will do is simply tell the story. I'll tell the story of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, and with that, may the blessings come." And so it was. Most emblematic of Jews and Judaism, more than anything else, are our stories. We have a fascination, we have an obsession with stories. We tell them like nobody else. Why do you think Jews make up so much of Hollywood's TV and movie industry? We're storytellers. Good books, good movies, good stories. Storytelling is our specialty. It's part of our genetic makeup. Indeed, every aspect of our lives is animated, is informed, is enriched by stories. From the 5 books of Moses, the Torah is told to us, mostly through stories. The books of the prophets, stories. The Medrash, stories. Even in the Talmud, there is the Agadatas, stories. How many books and books are there of tales of the Baal Shem Tov, of Hasidic stories throughout the generations? From the golden years of Spain to the Inquisition to the flourishing of European Jewry, Holocaust stories, modern-day Israel stories, blossoming of Judaism in America stories, millions upon millions of stories. Every Jewish holiday is, what do? We tell stories. We sit around the Passover table. What's the focus? Tell the story. The holiday of Sukkot, we tell the story of our ancestors in the wilderness. Shavuot, we tell the story of being in the wilderness and receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. Everything is about stories, telling it to our children so that our children will tell it to their children. You see, a good Jewish story is not just there to amuse or to entertain. A good Jewish story is rich in symbolism. It has meaning. It's instructive. It's inspiring. A story can break through barriers that prayers sometimes cannot. A good Jewish story can build bridges across vast oceans of time and of space. Someone once said a storyteller is like a travel agent. He can gather us from wherever we are, and he can put us down in any other setting. Like a heavenly chariot, a good Jewish story transports us to new places of wisdom and wonder. So people often ask me why in all my talks I tell so many stories. Every sermon, story. I start with a story. I end with a story. You ask a question with a story. You answer with a story. What's with all the stories? So I said, let me tell you a story. But seriously, I find that stories can convey deep concepts and ideas, at times more clearly and profoundly than straight oratory. Stories have a way to the soul. Stories perhaps are whispers of the soul. They're soul-to-soul conversation. And the thing is, you never know where the next great Jewish story might be born. How many stories are being written right here over these few days? How many connections are being made? How many people are finding other people that they've never met, and suddenly a story is being developed, a relationship is being developed? Every single day, stories are being written through real-life experiences. But of course, nowhere are greater Jewish stories born than on the streets of Jerusalem. The very stones of Jerusalem have stories to tell. Those of you who had visited the Kotel, the Western Wall, may have noticed an elderly man. He wears a guard's uniform, and he walks around the Kotel, especially in the morning hours, looking after little things. He organizes, he cleans up, he puts the Siddurim back, he puts the Bima tables back in place. So someone got around to talking to this man and asked him how he got this job in his elderly years. And of course, he had a story to tell. And the story has been published all over the world. His name is Binyamin Wurzburger. Binyamin was originally from Hungary. As a teenager, he was sent to the camps where he was forced to drag heavy railroad ties and lay tracks for the Germans. When it came time to eat, he would just be given a few scraps of food to eat. Sometimes a potato, sometimes just potato peels. But Binyamin would say that for all the horrors, there's one memory that always stayed with him. Every day while standing on line for his scraps of food, there was a Nazi commander who would stand there and he would taunt them. And he would say, "Do you dream of getting to Jerusalem, you Jews? I bet you do." And then with a sadistic laugh, he would say, "It's possible, you know. Maybe your ashes will blow out of those chimneys and fly to Jerusalem. Your ashes will get there, but you never will." And so Binyamin Wurzburger relates, "I was beaten, I was humiliated, I was starved, I was worked literally to the bone. In later years, I was sent on one of those horrible death marches of which only a handful survived. But every day, I would think of that Nazi's words, and I would will myself to go on, to live, so that I can show him one day I will make it to Jerusalem. Not just my ashes, my body. I will be there. I was the only member of my family to survive the Holocaust. And after many journeys, I made it to Israel. I got married. I raised a beautiful family. And when I retired from my job, my wife and children thought that I would now stay home and relax. But I had one more important mission in life. I walked into the office of the Western Wall Heritage Foundation, the organization that maintains and renovates the area of the Kotel that oversees it. And I said, I want to work for you. I want a job. The manager looked at me and said, you're an old man. We can't exactly hire you. I said, no, you don't understand. I'm not here to be paid. I want to volunteer. And trust me, you won't be disappointed. Anything you need done, I would like to do. And so Binyamin Wurzberger was given the task of cleaning the stones of the Kotel. Binyamin wakes up 5 a.m. every day to begin his labor of love. I never look at my watch when I'm at work. When I stand near these holy stones, I hear the words every morning of that Nazi officer. And then I look as thousands of my brothers and sisters come proudly to pray at the wall, and I smile. For this I live. Each and every one of us have a Jewish story, a story that's deeply personal, that speaks to us directly, a story that sends us a message, a story that if we tuned in, we would know how to recognize them as a life-changing story. A number of years ago, there was a woman who lived in Ramat Gan, Israel, Mrs. Lerner. Mrs. Lerner had a job working for this company which basically enabled her to support her family. And she felt very fortunate. Economic ties in Israel during this story were very, very tough. And she was lucky to have this position. The problem was that she was 3 months pregnant. And the big question that she had was, would their job still be waiting for her after she gave birth and took off for maternity leave? Laws in Israel at that time for maternity leave were not as good as they are today. And so she had anxiety about, will the job still be here when I come back to work? And to make matters worse, her husband had been out of work for 6 months. And her brother, who was now living with them, was also unemployed. So at the time, Mrs. Lerner was the only breadwinner of the family. And this job was critical and crucial to their survival. And so she was filled with anxiety every day, what to say to the boss and when to say it. One afternoon, the owner of the company, we'll call him Mr. Fisher, came by the workplace, and he was having lunch in the cafeteria with all the workers. It was kind of a relaxed environment. It was informal. So Mrs. Lerner thought, perhaps this is the environment that I need. And she sits down at the table where Mr. Fisher is sitting, and she begins to explain the situation. My husband is unemployed. My brother is unemployed. He moved into our house. And no one knows this yet but my husband and now you. I'm 3 months pregnant. And I'm a little bit concerned about when I take off for maternity leave that the job I have is still waiting for me. He wasn't in position to commit so quickly to anything, and he changed the subject. And then other people came to the table, and the subject clearly changed. And she felt a lost opportunity. She didn't get the answer she was hoping for. The people around the table started chatting about their past histories, their places of birth, what growing up was like. And Mrs. Lerner mentioned that she was originally from the East Flatbush section of Brooklyn. Mr. Fisher's interest was suddenly piqued. Where in East Flatbush were you? Oh, there, yeah. Where did you live? What street? And starts asking questions. What was your parents' name, grandparents' name? What did your grandfather do for a living? What synagogue did he go to? Who was the rabbi of the shul? And Mrs. Lerner is answering all these questions, but wondering why is Mr. Fisher suddenly so interested just in her story when there's all these other people around? Suddenly, Mr. Fisher got up and left the room. A little while later, he came back. His eyes were noticeably red. He then calmly told Mrs. Lerner that he wanted to tell her a story. Many years ago, he said, there were two electricians who lived in the same neighborhood in East Flatbush. One of these electricians was a union member and worked for a very large company and was very successful. The other electrician was a non-union member, and he constantly struggled to make a living. He basically scraped it together by searching for whatever small jobs he could land throughout the neighborhood. These two men attended the same synagogue. They were somewhat friendly. Although they occasionally walked each other home from shul on Shabbos, the families didn't know one another. And one day, tragedy struck. The poor fellow, the non-union electrician, had a massive heart attack. And within days, he passed away. When the other electrician came to the house to pay condolences during Shiva to the wife and to the children, he couldn't help but notice the impoverished state of this widow with her 6 children. He asked the woman if she had enough food, and she said, sure. But then he did what a nosy Jew would do. He walked into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator when it was empty. He opened the pantry and it was empty. So that afternoon, this electrician went to the grocery store. And he came back an hour later loaded with food of all kinds and filled the refrigerator with meats and chickens and salads and everything you can possibly have, and then filled the pantry with all types of foods. And he did this every single day of Shiva. He would come loaded with bags of food. And then Shiva was over, he wouldn't stop. Every Friday before Shabbos, he would just continuously bring food, and the widow was embarrassed already. It's enough. You've done enough for us. And she couldn't stop him. A couple of months after the tragedy, the widow called the electrician and said, my basement is filled with all these electrical tools and supplies that my late husband accumulated over the years. Would you be perhaps interested in taking all of it, because we have no need for it? So the next evening, this electrician came to the house. He went down to the basement. It was a total mess. It was all over the place. And for 3 weeks straight, he spent every evening there organizing, cleaning up, putting things together. And when everything was in place, he made phone calls to all other electricians he knew throughout the city. And he notified them of a special sale that would take place on a Sunday. And everyone should show up and look what they would like to purchase. And all these contractors came running for a good bargain. And on that day, he sold over $5,000 worth of material, which he obviously gave over to the widow for her and her family. The workers sitting in this cafeteria in Ramat Gan are listening to Mr. Fisher tell the story. He then turns to Mrs. Lerner and says, I want you to know that the electrician who organized that sale, who helped that widow and her children, was your grandfather, Tzvi Ackerman. And I was one of those 6 orphans who watched him do it. He said his father died at a young age. His brothers and sisters were just young kids. But none of us ever forgot what your Zaidi did for our mother during that period of time. Mrs. Lerner, make no mistake about it, you will always have a job with this company. And tomorrow morning, I want you to have your husband and your brother show up, because I have jobs for them here as well. That night, a tearful Mrs. Lerner went home and wrote a letter to her grandfather, who was still alive. All it said was, thank you, Zaidi. I'm so proud to be your granddaughter. A man in Brooklyn, New York sees the despair of a family and decides to seize the moment and do something about it. And it shows up decades later in Ramat Gan, Israel. So we hear this story, and it changes us. It affects us. It talks to our very soul. It makes us think the next time an opportunity for a mitzvah, an act of kindness presents itself, we think of Mrs. Lerner, we think of her grandfather, we think of Mr. Fisher. and it motivates us to act, to make their story part of our story. There's a very famous story out there. In fact, it's the title of a book called The Storyteller. And I'll try to summarize the story because it's rather long. So I may leave out some details, but just for the spirit of time, I'd like to just present you a synopsis of the story. Before the Baal Shem Tov passed away, he gave each of his disciples an individual mission, what they should become in life. Each one was told what they should be. One of his disciples, the Baal Shem Tov, turned to him and said, and you should be a storyteller. A storyteller? Not much of a living there. This is what I want you to do. I want you to travel from town to town and tell the stories that you saw during our days together. Tell Baal Shem Tov stories wherever you go. And maybe the communities where you go and tell the stories will give you a few kopecks here. It wasn't exactly the dream career he was hoping for, but it's what the Baal Shem Tov told him to do. So indeed, after the Baal Shem Tov's passing, this chassid would go town to town, city to city, telling over incredible tales of the Baal Shem Tov. One day, this chassid heard that there was a wealthy nobleman living near the Polish border that always pays a good price, a nice amount, if he heard stories of the Baal Shem Tov. Oh, that's what he's been waiting for. But it was far away. It would take weeks to get there. But what he hears is that this nobleman pays a nice price. So he makes the journey. And after weeks of travel, he arrives at this mansion and he knocks on the door and he tells the doorkeeper that he is a former disciple of the Baal Shem Tov who is now a Baal Shem Tov storyteller. The doorkeeper escorts him into the nobleman's office, who's sitting behind his desk, and the nobleman says, perfect, start speaking, let's hear the story. And at that moment, the chassid's mind goes blank. Blank. He can't remember a thing. Nothing. He's having amnesia. This is so odd. This is what I do every day of my life, and suddenly I can't remember a thing. So the nobleman says, don't worry about it. It must have been the journey. I have a guest room for you. Rest up. At some point, it'll come back to you. The next morning, still nothing. Again, the nobleman, kind and sweet, don't worry, you can stay as long as you'd like. At some point, it'll come to you. Day after day, he waited. Nothing. Not a single story. This is so odd. And finally, in utter embarrassment and shame, he tells the nobleman, I can't stay here any longer. This is wrong. I'm eating your food, I'm staying in your guest house, and I'm not delivering anything. I'm going to go home. The nobleman was very sad and said, are you sure you don't want to stay? And he said, I can't do this any longer. And as he's walking out the door, suddenly, one story comes to mind, just one. And he turns to the nobleman, he says, I just remembered one story. And the nobleman says, speak now, don't wait, just talk. And he begins to tell the story. I remember once he said someone came to see the Baal Shem Tov. He was very upset. He told the Baal Shem Tov that he used to be a good God-fearing Jew, but the temptations of the outside world beckoned. And I felt that my Jewish identity was depriving me of the pleasures of the world. So I converted out of my faith. I became very rich, very successful, and very powerful. And not only did I abandon my religion, but then the guilt of it bothered me so much, so I did a lot to hurt my own people, to hurt the Jewish community. I guess it helped suppress my guilt. I would seek every opportunity to conspire against the Jews. Recent events, however, have led me to realize how vile and wrong my behavior has been. And so I'm begging you, help me find my way home. Help me find my way back to my people. The Baal Shem Tov proceeded to tell this man different things that he would need to do, how he would have to help people, how he would have to repent of his ways. And when the Baal Shem Tov finished giving him his entire prescription of salvation, this individual said to the Baal Shem Tov, and how will I know? How will I know that I've ever been forgiven? And the Baal Shem Tov said, you will know that you've been forgiven the day someone comes and tells you the story. And he finished saying these words. The chassid looks up and he sees the nobleman with a big smile. And suddenly he recognized the face. And the nobleman said, "Thank you. Thank you for restoring my soul." When two Jews meet and share a story, you never know. You never know that if that story is the story your soul has been waiting for and craving for so long. And now that you've heard it, your life will never be the same again, because that story is your story. That story is God tapping you on the shoulder and saying, "There's something I need you to do. I gave you a special talent. I gave you a special gift. Now go forth and paint your masterpiece and shine your light." Let's understand, not all of us are inspired or compelled to create masterpieces of large scales, but nor do we have to. Our daily lives can become masterpieces. We each have our own places and our own situations where we shine, where we can make a difference, where we can have an impact. The key is to perk up to your story when you hear it and respond to it by writing one of your own. See, life is not only about the big and the impressive. It's not only about the great moments of inspiration and motivation. In the words of motivational speaker Zig Ziglar, he says, when people say, "What's the point of getting all inspired and motivated? Motivation doesn't last," I say, bathing doesn't either. That's why I recommend it daily. Every day should have within its sources of inspiration and motivation. Every day of life is precious. And I hate to be the one to break this to you, but we don't have an unlimited supply of them. There's only so much time we have on this planet to write our stories, to create our masterpieces. Do you know what they say the number one fear in life of most people are? When they ask people to write their greatest fear in life, according to most studies, people's number one fear in life is public speaking. Public speaking. And do you know what the number two fear is? Death. Now, it's strange because that means that the average person then who goes to a funeral would rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy. But there are people who give a lot of thought about what might be said about them for their eulogy, or what should be written on their tombstones. Someone once told me that in a Jewish cemetery, he saw this entire section of tombstones that were engraved with symbols of bowling balls on them. The tombstones were inscribed, each one, "We lived to bowl." See, it was part of some bowling league, and they all decided together, on our tombstones, we're going to talk about how much we loved getting together to bowl. But really, my point is not to focus on eulogies or tombstones. But more importantly, what stories are we telling now? It doesn't have to be the stories they will tell about us. But what story are we involved in right now? Not after 120 years, but today. In order to create good stories, we need to have worthy goals. What's the goals today of most Americans? To retire early, to be able to put enough away, to have enough wealth so that I can retire early. To retire at 55, to retire at 50, to never have to work again. And then you ask the question, and then what? So what happens after retirement? What are you going to do for the next 60 years? How many times can you read the daily newspaper or go on Drudge Report? How many times could you go on Google to see how to make blintzes in any different type of way? So the big fascination today is golf. You retire, you get yourself a set of golf clubs, and you go golfing 6 days a week. A new religion, golf. Sam Goldstein and his friend Gus were playing golf one day in their local golf course. Sam is about to chip onto the next green when he sees a long funeral procession on the road next to the course. He stops in mid-swing. He bows his head, closes his eyes, and says a prayer. Gus sees us and says, wow, Sam, that was so thoughtful and so touching what I just saw you do, that you stopped in the middle to do that and show that respect. And Sam says, yeah, well, again, we've been married for 35 years. It's the least I can do. Another time, Sam and Gus met in the clubhouse of the golf course, and Gus says to Sam, I hear you had a tragedy while you were on the golf course here last week. He says, yeah, I was playing this twosome with Harry. In the 9th hole, Harry had a heart attack. He dropped dead right there. Gus says, yeah, I heard someone told me you carried him all the way back to the clubhouse. That must have been tough. Harry weighed over 200 pounds, right? Sam says, well, the carrying part wasn't so hard. It was putting him down for every stroke and then picking him back up again. That was the killer. So Baruch Hashem, there are certain rituals that we're very religiously committed to. But if that's what retirement is all about, I can tell you that Yiddishkeit, Judaism, is not very big on retirement. Judaism says that as long as there's a breath of life in you, there's something you can do to make a difference. A masterpiece that you can paint. A story that you can tell. So my friends, what kind of stories are we writing? What kind of stories can be told about us? It doesn't have to be earth-shattering, mountain-moving to make it a good story. You don't have to cure cancer, although that would be great. You don't have to paint the most Mona Lisa to create your own masterpiece in life. If you simply go and visit someone in the hospital that's lonely, that's scared, that's a masterpiece. Spend some time visiting a senior facility and just visit people and sing with them and play with them. That's a masterpiece. We heard last night during the 10 talks stories that were masterpieces. We heard during dinner yesterday the story of Rifki Darren Berman. How many of you are wiping away the tears? It's a masterpiece. You can be raising your own children. Not always headline-grabbing stuff, not too much fanfare there, but if you raise them with good values and healthy priorities and a strong sense of identity, that's a masterpiece too. You know the story, this woman was once in the supermarket and their 3-year-old girl was having one of those fits. You know those fits that kids reserve for the supermarket? It's a special fit. They have it training before they come down to earth. They're told when you go to the supermarket, that's where you have the fit. You see, the kid knows. They point to any product on the shelf and they say they want that. Mommy says you can't have it, and the sirens go off. It's part of the kid's manual. The sirens go off as soon as mommy says you can't have it. Well, this kid, this 3-year-old, was on full throttle that day. My gosh, everyone in this market can hear her going, all guns blazing. And very calmly, the woman says, Sarah, don't cry. Very soon you'll be home, and everything will be fine. The kid wouldn't let up. Sure enough, she launches into the siren of all sirens. And everybody's peeking. Everyone's looking like, what's going on? Is this mom beating the kid because the kid's screaming? Mother keeps her voice measured. Sarah, please don't cry. In a few minutes, you'll be in the car on your way home, and all will be good. In the meantime, there's another shopper watching all of this, and she's so impressed with the mom, how calm she is, and how she's talking to this obnoxious child in such a calm voice. And the demands are getting louder and louder, and the fits are more animated, and she's staying cool. Sarah, don't cry. Soon we'll all be done. Soon we'll be home. Maybe you'll even take a nap. And finally, this other shopper comes over and says, I must tell you that I'm so impressed how calmly you keep talking to little Sarah there. And the mom looks and says, oh no, she's Rachel, I'm Sarah. So indeed, raising good children can be an artful masterpiece as any. But take any mitzvah where you can shine, whether it's getting involved in your shul. And if you already go to shul on a regular basis, How's about working to inspire others to come to shul? Or it's about putting on tefillin. If you already do that, how about inspiring others to put on tefillin? Or lighting Shabbos candles? Or volunteering time with children with special needs? Or serving as a mentor to troubled teenagers? Or finding lonely people that are in desperate need of a shidduch and making it something of your own, that you're going to invest time and effort to bringing two lonely people together. Whatever resonates with your character and matches your inclinations, make it your thing. Make it your story. Make it part of your masterpiece, and do it passionately and do it exceptionally to where it becomes your story. Stories that will build bridges between you and your fellows, stories that will create bonds between one generation and another generation, between one world and those of another world. The first Israeli soldier killed in 2008 Gaza war was a young man by the name of Dvir Aminalov. Needless to say, his mother, Dalia Aminalov, was completely shattered, and she missed her son terribly. One night before she went to bed, she said in a loud voice, "God Almighty, please, I'm begging you, give me a sign, give me a hug from Dvir, give me something so that I'll know that his death had some meaning." That week, Dalia's daughter asked her to accompany her to a musical performance at the International Crafts Festival in Jerusalem. Feeling quite despondent still, Dalia had no interest and desire to go to a concert. But at the same time, she didn't want to disappoint her daughter. She felt that her daughter needed to find something, some joy, and so she agreed to go. As it turns out, the concert was a bit delayed, and they're waiting for the program to start. And this 3-year-old little boy begins wandering around the auditorium, restlessly going through the stands. And this 3-year-old walks up to Dalia's seat and touches her on the shoulder. And being a preschool teacher, Dalia turned around and saw this boy and smiled. "What's your name?" Dalia asked. "Eshel," the boy answered. "That's such a nice name. Do you want to be my friend, Eshel?" And the boy said yes. And the boy sits down next to Dalia. In the meantime, the parents of little Eshel says, "Eshel, come back. And Dalia turns, it's okay, we're having a good time together." Eshel's parents were just a few rows away. As little children tend to do, this 3-year-old Eshel suddenly pipes up with a statement that had nothing to do with anything. He says to Dalia, "I have a baby brother. His name is Dvir." And Dalia was caught a bit by surprise to hear the name Dvir being mentioned by this 3-year-old. "Do you want to see my baby?" asked Eshel. And the little kid starts tugging Dalia's hand to come with him to see his baby brother. And Dalia gets up and goes to where Eshel's parents were sitting and sees this little beautiful baby boy in a carriage. And she says, "Slicha, with apologies, if you don't mind me asking, when was your baby born?" And the mom said he was born right after the war in Gaza. "And why did you choose the name Dvir?" Baby Dvir's mother began to explain. "When I was at the end of my pregnancy, the doctors suspected that the fetus may have a very serious birth defect. Since it was the end of the pregnancy, there was little the doctors could do, and I just had to wait to see how things would turn out. When I went home that night, the news reported the first casualty in the War of the Soldier, named Dvir. I was so saddened by the news that I decided to make a deal with God. God, if you give me a healthy son, I promise to name him Dvir in memory of that brave soldier that was killed." Dalia, the mother of Dvir, stood there with her mouth open. She tried to speak, but she couldn't. And finally, after a long silence, she said, "I'm Dvir's mother." The young parent couldn't believe her. She repeated, "I'm Dvir's mother. My name is Dalia Aminalov." With a sudden inspiration, baby Dvir's mother handed Dalia the baby and said, "Here, hold Dvir. He wants to give you a hug." Dahlia held this little baby boy in her arms and looked into his angelic face. The emotion she felt at the moment was overwhelming. She had asked for a hug from Dvir, and there she was holding a baby named after her son Dvir. Some of you may have heard about this list that used to come out in Newsweek magazine. The 50 most influential rabbis in America. Anyone remember it? For a few years in a row, the rabbi that was voted the most prominent and influential was Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, chairman of the Central Organizing Committee of Chabad Lubavitch. Now, when I first heard this, I found it rather curious. Rabbi Krinsky? Rabbi Krinsky has no congregation. He's not a pulpit rabbi, doesn't give classes, doesn't give sermons, didn't write a book. How can he be the most influential rabbi in America? But you know, it makes perfect sense. And I assure you, I mean no disrespect to Rabbi Krinsky, as I've said this right in front of him when I introduced him to speak at our Chabad house. And he is the first to sign on to my thesis on this. It wasn't about Rabbi Krinsky. It was about the man for whom Rabbi Krinsky served as secretary and personal driver for some 40 years. It was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who physically may have passed away 22 years ago, but continues to have the greatest influence and impact on world Jewry to this day. So Newsweek didn't want to put someone that wasn't alive. So they put his secretary's name there. But they meant the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You see, this is the spirit and the vitality of a Jewish story. When a story is that powerful, you can be physically absent for 22 years and still be the most present person on earth. It's a phenomenon as old as Judaism itself. We sing it when we sing the famous song, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. He is living and he endures. Not the memory of King David lives. He lives. King David lives. But you say, but he died and he was buried and there are monuments. How can you say he lives? The answer is because the stories of King David lives. His masterpieces live, and therefore he lives. As the Baal Shem Tov said, our stories have a way of removing the barriers between heaven and earth. Ladies and gentlemen, before I conclude, I'm going to share with you one of the most devastating events of my youth. Not just of my youth, but of any that grew up in Crown Heights at the time that I was growing up. Back in our neighborhood, there was a very sweet boy named Avremi, a very studious, sincere, and sensitive boy. We sang together in a children's choir. He had an exceptionally beautiful voice. Avremi was 2 years older than me. He was around 16 at the time of the story. He studied in the Chabad yeshiva called Olei Torah, located on Troy Avenue in Crown Heights. One day, Avremi approached one of his friends in the yeshiva, and he discussed a certain phone call he thought that they should make together. Now, in those days, kids didn't have cell phones. Adults didn't have cell phones either. So these two boys stepped out of the yeshiva, and they walked to a phone booth. Most kids today don't know what a phone booth is, but for those in our generation, it was an actual booth. You opened the door, you went inside, and you made a phone call. Avremi entered the booth to make the call, while the friend stood right outside the phone booth. Avremi was in the thick of his conversation when these three hooligans approached the boy standing outside the booth. They didn't demand anything. They didn't say a word. One of them pulled out an ice pick from inside his jacket, and thrust it at the boy standing outside the booth. By reflex, the boy jumped back, and the weapon struck only ear. The hooligans then turned their attention to the boy inside the booth. Unfortunately, he had nowhere to run, nowhere to jump when the thrust came at him. And he was stabbed 3 times in the chest. Their blood mission accomplished, the hooligans ran off. The standing boy grabbed his friend and began running with him back to the yeshiva, yelling for help. The ambulance came quickly. Avremi was rushed to the hospital, but by the time he arrived, he was already gone. The family of this beautiful young man was broken. The entire community, especially all of the youth, we were in total shock. As you can imagine, back then, nobody was all too interested in the minor details as to what happened that night. Who was Avremi calling 9 o'clock that night? Why, when the parents went into Avremi's bedroom, did they find a bag of cookies and a bottle of wine? None of this seemed to matter in the greater scheme of things. The darkness was too great for such things to matter to the parents. The boy that was outside the booth was too consumed with shock and with grief, coupled with the trauma of then having to face the murderers and testify against them in court, to ever go back and further revisit the events of that night. A few years ago, 33 years after this tragedy, the boy who was standing outside the phone booth that night, now a grown man, gets a call. It's one of Avremi's brothers. His parents want to know. 33 years later, they're asking for some of the missing pieces to fill in the details of that night. I heard this directly from the boy that was outside the booth, as he was someone living in Agora Hills at the time. His name is Shmulik. The cousin of the deceased boy is sitting in the room right now as well. Rabbi Yossi Gordon's relative. So the family is asking of Shmulik, why were you guys out there that night? Who was Avremi talking to on the phone when he was attacked? So Shmulik proceeds to provide the missing pieces. He explained that he and Avremi had a weekly Miftzayim route. Miftzayim route is where on Fridays we were sent out to different places of New York to put on tefillin with people, to give out Shabbos candles. So they were assigned to a particular street in Manhattan where there was a stretch of electronics stores, mostly owned by Israelis. They would visit with the storekeepers, they would talk to them, whoever would be interested in putting on tefillin, they would put on tefillin with them. So Shmulik goes on to say that there was one guy on their route who was quite secular, but nevertheless always welcomed them and always, as he said, tolerated them. One week when Avremi and Shmulik showed up, the guy tells him that his wife just had a baby girl. So they wished him mazel tov. And then they got into this whole conversation about this would be a good time for your wife to start lighting Shabbos candles in honor of the baby. And then we said, you know what, if your wife just had this baby girl, why don't you come on Monday? Come to 770 Eastern Parkway. We'll meet you by the Rebbe's Minyan. And there you'll name your baby. You'll give your baby a Jewish name at the Torah in front of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He says, I don't know, I'm not religious, I'm not so interested, I never did that for my other kids. He wasn't up for it. But we were persistent, we were kids. We started pushing and we started pressuring. We're giving you an opportunity to name your baby in front of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. How could you not? It'll be such a blessing for her, it'll be so important for her. And finally he said, okay, fine. He writes down the address, Monday morning, this is the time to be there. Okay. Avremi went and bought some cookies and some wine. so that after the baby naming, they can say a little l'chaim and make a bracha. Sunday night in yeshiva, Avremi walks over to Shmulek and he says, I have a feeling he's going to back out. So why don't we go and call him now and remind him that we'll be waiting for him tomorrow morning? And Shmulek said, yeah, it's a good idea. It was with this father that Avremi was conversing or negotiating that fateful night in the phone booth. And the man was indeed trying to back out. I thought about it. I don't know. And Avremi said, no, you're coming. You're coming. And by the way, did your wife light a Shabbos candle? And it was at that very moment that he was brutally murdered. Those words were his last. Shmulek finished filling in the missing pieces to Avremi's brother. Avremi's brother said, thank you. That explains a lot for us. So Shmulek said, now, I answered all of your questions. Can you answer one of mine? He said, sure. Why, after 33 years, are you calling me now? Why now? So the brother says, I'll tell you why now. The other night, my parents got a phone call. It was a woman calling from Israel. She said her name is Pam, also known as Pesha. She said, you don't know me, but I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I come from a secular family. None of my siblings are religious, but for some reason, I always had not just a curiosity, but an intense thirst for spirituality. Although I didn't receive much of a Jewish education, I tried to learn whatever I could, wherever I could. Several years ago, I made Aliyah to Israel. I attended a Jewish study program, and soon enough, I started living a total observant lifestyle. She went on to say, one time my father came to visit me, and he said, there's something I think you should know. When you were born, 2 yeshiva boys came to see me. They insisted that I go to the synagogue to give you a Jewish name at the Torah on Monday morning. And I didn't want to go. Well, that Sunday night, one of them called me. He was talking to me about the importance of doing this for you, my dear daughter. When he was killed, he was murdered right then in the middle of the conversation with me. When I pieced together what had happened, because it was all over the news that night, there was no way I could not respect this dying man's wish. So I went to the synagogue Monday morning, and I gave you a Jewish name, Pesha, just like that passionate, caring yeshiva boy pleaded with me to do. In the days thereafter, I went to the parents' home where they were sitting shiva, and I wanted to go over to them to say something, but I couldn't do it. There was such pain, there was such tears, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I wish that I had, but I never did. And for years, I put this whole story out of my mind. But now, my dear daughter, I see how devoted you are to your Jewish heritage. I thought you should know how it is that you got your Jewish name. This is what this woman is telling Avremi's parents over the phone. She said, not long after telling me this story, my father passed away. He died young. But I'm so grateful that he shared this story with me before leaving this world, because you see, all along, I've always felt there is someone up there calling me, rooting me on my spiritual journeys. I could have ignored it, but it was such a powerful tug, and it wouldn't let go. I've always believed that it was that tug from above that pushed me to leading the life that I'm living now. I have 2 sons, Eldad and Aviv. They're about to start cheder now. And I truly believe that that tug came from that boy who in his last moments of life made sure that I would get my Jewish name at the Torah. So now at the age of 33, I did the research. I looked up a boy murdered 33 years ago while talking on the phone on a street in Crown Heights. I found the name. I found the parents. I found you. And although I know you know this, I want you to hear it from me. what a zchus, what a privilege you had to bring such a lofty soul into this world, even for such a short time. I hope that you will agree to see me when I come to New York to visit in the near future. I think that my father and your son would appreciate that very much. 33 years after this most horrific tragedy, these parents finally get to hear the rest of the story, or at least part of it. And so many of our stories remain unfinished. Each and every day we pray for a time where we'll finally learn the rest of the story, that we'll be able to put everything into proper context so that we finally have more answers than questions. But in the meantime, we must hear the stories. We must share the stories, for they are the lifelines to our essence. We must sit with our children and tell them stories, the stories of their heritage, the stories of their ancestors, but not just tell it to them. We must tell it to them with passion, with excitement, with enthusiasm. We have to bring it alive. We have to make those stories your own stories. In conclusion, I want you to imagine with me for one moment. I want you to travel to the heavenly world, just for a short visit. We're not staying. In the heavenly world, there's a big library, a beautiful library. Many, many shelves, mahogany wood, leather-bound books, all organized. Every book has a name on it in alphabetical order. And you realize that every name of every human being has a book. So you immediately go rushing and running to find your name. And you find a leather-bound book with your name on it. You take the book off the shelf and you start reading. It's the story of your life. Every detail. Your triumphs, your struggles, the joys, the sorrows, the hopes, the fears, the ups, the downs, the highs, the lows. You read on, it's told so accurately. And you get to the end of the written pages. And the last day says, Thursday, August 18th, 2016. It says you're sitting at the National Jewish Retreat in Palm Springs, California. And the book stops. But it doesn't end, because there are many, many, many blank pages left to fill in. Go write your masterpiece. Thank you very much.